Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. My name's Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by economist Bart Wilson to talk about his new book, Meaningful Economics, Making the Science of Prosperity More Human. And Bart was actually the first guest I ever interviewed. Not episode 1, he's not the first episode released in the first 5, but I recall distinctly that you were the first guest that I ever interviewed. So thank you so much for joining me and for writing another book.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me again.
The subtitle, Making the Science of Prosperity More Human. What's insufficiently human about economics, and why does it need to be more human?
Well, the way I read the history of economic thought is we spent the last 100 years taking the human being out of the study of economic science. And we have replaced human beings with this idea of utility maximization. And so we see everything that human beings do through that lens. And I think we miss a lot of what it is to be human, and we're missing some of the key parts of economics because we don't see the human being as a whole.
You maybe just answered part of this question, but where and when and why do you think econ took this direction and went wrong in your view?
I think it's been a slow process. If you look at the founding of the field, it's Adam Smith. I think everyone recognizes that. And if you read Adam Smith and you kind of internalize what he's up to, he very much puts the human being at the center of how he understands the economic system. He's very much interested in the wealth of nations, about how we create wealth. Why is it there's a general plenty in the world? And he wants to know what practical things people do to bring that about. And then his other key book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is all about our morality and our sociality. And that's, again, all about human beings. And that really was the core about economics. What is it that creates wealth? What makes us better off in the world? From Adam Smith all the way up until, I would say, the late 19th century. And then there was the marginal turn, kind of the scene of becoming modern economics, where we want to understand that people make decisions on the margin. And that was seeing kind of clearing up some holes in understanding the classical system of how markets work. And Alfred Marshall saw himself as continuing that Adam Smith tradition. His book has a lot of his main textbook there has a lot on Adam Smith, connecting himself to it. And he described economics very famously as the study of the ordinary business of life. And I think that's a genius way of thinking about what economics is about, because it puts the emphasis on what is going on out there in the world. What are people doing? What's ordinary life like? And then the Smithian part of that is, well, how is it that we create economic betterment? How does that come about? And I think that was working and fine, and then started to change. I put the change at Lionel Robbins in the 30s, in 1932, where his very famous definition about economics being about the science of how scarce means are being used for alternative uses. And scarcity becomes the key point for him. And he's very clear. He is talking to, I think, Edward Kennan, who had a book about wealth, which was very much in the tradition of Adam Smith. He was speaking to him saying, no, it's not about wealth. It's about scarcity. Scarcity is first. And scarcity coming first means everything else comes second. And it's because things are scarce that we must choose. And then you can see how the kind of neoclassical idea of choosing on the margin becomes the centerpiece of how we understand economics. And that assumes then that what this foundation of Smith's system is that people trade one thing for another. And that was his starting point. And Robbins says quite clearly, that's secondary. That becomes, because we have scarcity, therefore we must choose. And therefore, all the trading goes about because things are scarce. I think that's backwards. It's the fact that we are traders first, and that what does that mean? Why is that important first? Because no other animal does this. Your podcast is named in honor of Matt Ridley, Ideas Having Sex. It was his book, The Rational Optimist, that put at the foreground that human beings are the only species to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. And that was the core of Adam Smith. Matt Ridley recognized that, and economics has lost that. And I'll just point one last thing about that. If you pick up textbooks introducing economics, the beginning point is always scarcity. It doesn't talk about trading. Trading is just kind of taken for granted. But it's that reason that we trade, that we can create wealth and that we can get the whole Adam Smith project off the ground in the first place. And so that's why I think we've missed what it is to be human because of what makes trade possible. And then we can go into like, what is it that makes trade human?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I can see why someone might make scarcity so fundamental, but would you say that scarcity is fundamental, but it's not distinguishing, it's not unique? Because every animal faces scarcity, but is it that part of the way that humans manage scarcity through trade that makes it more uniquely human?
So to say that we face scarcity means that we perceive the world to be not as good as we would like it to be. We would like more, and we would like to find a way to make ourselves better. If we face scarcity, that's what we see, and that's what's going through our minds. And therefore, then we work to find a way to kind of get out of that. What is that working way to get out of that? That is trade. And as I argue in the book, and that is property, and that is the division of labor, something that humans have made the most extensive in the natural world. And so scarcity is like, there are objective facts of the world, but it's our perception of the world and how we then act in the world that actually is the foundation of economics. It is because we can trade that we see that we can ameliorate scarcity. We can find ways around it. And so that's why I would argue trade comes first.
Would you say you're not objecting to some of the tools and things that other economists are using and, references to scarcity or marginality or anything like that, but you think that they're being misused or being placed more centrally than they should be?
I became an economist because I wanted to make the world better in a way. I saw those tools as a way like, oh, this is how we get more out of less. And that's exciting. But how is it and why is it? And so I would say the notion of scarcity and these tools of marginal analysis became all tools about how. How do we get more? How does that happen? And we don't ask ourselves, why does it? Why are we able to make the world richer? And so how is a great question. It is a fundamental question, but it seems to be the only question in the way economists approach the problem. And part of my book project is to say, no, let's also ask why. And if we ask why, we might see that there's something behind how all of this works in economics.
How does this book, build on your previous work in the property species, which we talked about last time, and humanomics, which we didn't talk about?
In a way of asking that question, this book does follow from both of those. And so in the humanomics book with Vernon Smith, we noticed that Adam Smith could help us understand what was going on in the laboratory in our experiments with trust and reciprocity. And he has a model that actually explains the causes of why people do what they do. And we ended that book saying that, well, if we really want to understand the science of economic betterment in human beings, we're going to have to understand it jointly as a study of social betterment in human beings, that those two things are tied. And so that's always been in the back of my mind since we finished that book. And then when I finished the property species book, I was doing all of this work of trying to understand where property fits in the natural world, where it comes from, and that there might be a more systematic way of organizing what I'd done that book. Literally, I'd sent the book off to be printed, and I read David Haig's From Darwin to Derrida, and I realized, oh, he's given me this model to not just kind of critique economics, but now to build something that can go along on the side of how we currently study economics. And so I thought, well, I can systematize what was going on in property. Can I do the same thing with trade? And can I do the same thing with specialization? Which I would argue are the kind of three core principles. There are many other ones, but those are three core ones that I think every economist would recognize as being important to the study of economics. And they're all in some sense attributed, can be traced back to Adam Smith, that there's a way to add being human to our study of economics and show what it adds and what we're not capturing right now.
At some point early in the book, you make criticisms of some ways of practicing economics that economists talk about, that we have a utility function or something, and that, but that, don't ask like what's actually going on in the mind, or why we're doing what we're doing. That's not part of the question, or in some sense, like ignoring psychological explanations. You kind of describe that as like Samuelsonian economics, or as like he's like a representative of this kind of mid 20th century way of doing economics. And I wasn't sure at the time if you were going to be making the step that, like, it sounds like the next step there is that modern behavioral econ kind of answers that call. But what's your objection there, or why do you think they don't really fully answer the call?
Well, so what Samuelson does is to basically put at the foreground, this is utility maximization. Your set of preferences you take as given, you take a budget constraint as given, and then there's out pops from this your choice that you make. And so it was kind of putting preferences at the center of what we're doing. For economics, particularly in the mid 20th century, we needed to understand how is it that people adjust to changes in prices and changes in incomes. And so that model does that very well. But it was designed not to care what was going on up here. It's like prices change and we buy more or less of different stuff. And there's a regular way that happens. And that regularity then implies these larger things about what happens in markets. I think that's great and very useful and insightful. And we do a lot with that work in economics. But then we economists started seeing some other things going on, and particularly experimental economists in the laboratory, like, oh, but people aren't always kind of maximizing your utility. They're not taking more material rewards over less. They are sometimes saying, oh, no, I'll take less and give you more. And then they took the same model from Samuelson and applied it to it. And so they're trying to like take this idealized way of thinking how we trade off interests. Prices change, so therefore I trade off. I'll get a little bit more of this as the price goes down, a little bit less of something else. And saying, oh, that's what's going on when I'm doing good for other people. I'll do a little bit more here and then coming out a little bit less there. When the real explanation, when we do good things for other people, when we trust people, when we reciprocate their actions with our own, is that we have a motive for that. There's a why behind that, not just a how. And utility maximization doesn't get at the why. It is merely a how mechanism. We've imported into economics the same tools, but we're opening up the field to all these different kinds of problems of why is it people trust, why do people reciprocate, why do we do good things for others at our own material expense, which to ordinary people seems like what ordinary people do. But to economists, it's like, whoa, this seems new. This is different. How can we do this? And then we kind of just use the same tools and applied them to it.
What about the Austrian approach to economics? You take that on later in the book, and in some ways it seems like it would be really on point with, the title of your book is Meaningful Economics, and you talk a lot about meaning and purpose, and this seems pretty central to like Mises's project, his book, Human Action. Starts with a big discussion about purposeful human action. So what are the differences and similarities between these approaches?
So in contrast to Samuelson, Mises puts the human being right in the front. And he starts with this assumption or axiom that human beings act. We act purposefully. And so he talks about conduct, but then he doesn't talk about why that conduct works the way it does. He just says we've learned from experience that specializing makes more stuff. Therefore, we do it. And so he hasn't really built in what is the foundation for why human beings act? Why is it that we conduct ourselves the way we do? He just says we do. And I think that's great. And again, in a way, he gets to the same point as Samuelson of arguing logically then if we act, then we're acting in our interest. We are going to see the equimarginal principle in economics come out. And so I'm just asking to roll back the question one step. why do we do what we do when we trade? Why do we respect property? Why do we specialize? And add that to the discussion. And why is that important? Because I think we're missing a good part of the population. I at least do in students. When you give them the straight kind of analysis out of the textbook, there's about 20% it doesn't register with. Because at the core, it seems to be this notion that, oh, I'm maximizing my behavior. I'm kind of putting myself above other people. And that is kind of the tool puts that as the foundation. And they're saying that's not me. I don't do that. I have other purposes and meanings. And so my goal is let's recognize that those purposes or meaning are in the very tools of the principles of economics that we already teach. And maybe we can reach more people with our message in economics if we grant them that and not kind of set it off to the side.
I totally hear what you're saying. And I think depending on how economists talk about it, talk about maximizing your welfare or your utility or something like that, can immediately invoke an image of something fairly narrow and material, like getting as much money as you can. But is there another way to say that, like maximizing your values or something like that, that more broadly incorporates that also might include ethical concerns and fellow feeling for other people, but that still in some sense is about you, because you're the only one who controls you, maximizing what you care about?
But the notion of maximization kind of implies a trading off of something for something else. And I don't want to deny that that's not true, but I would argue that in the discussion of things about why we do good things, it's not a trade-off. And it's not even, as some economists say, an as-if trade-off. That we are doing good because we want to do good. And that's how I understand and make explanations for your behavior, that's how I know why you did what you did. And it was not a matter of, well, because he's trading off something for us, some good here for some good over there, but because that's what he wanted to do. That's how you felt. That's what you knew you could do. And that's what you wanted to do. And that is not necessarily about how, it's about why.
Maybe this is not what you're saying at all, but I'm picturing that this view entails some kind of pluralistic view about human motives, that there are goals and things that we want to do for their own sake that are incommensurable, that can't be traded off against each other, that some types of goods that we pursue are like getting more of one good or another good. I might be able to trade off against each other, but maybe there are other types of goods like moral goods that are either not or not as easily traded off against other goods.
What is important is that how and why, how and how much is part of the question. I mean, incommensurable things, not being able to kind of compare them, that might go more philosophically where it's not my strong point of trying to understand and to argue. What I want to say is, though, that we want to use how and how much as an explanation as a cause. And I'm arguing that that's just a process. There is no causation really in how that works. Why gives me causation? Because as intelligent beings, we attribute the causes of our actions to something internal to you, what you feel, what you want, what you think, what you know. And that is what we argue and make sense of every day as a cause of why you do what you do. And I'm saying that's also part of it, not just how much of what you've done, because that answers the why.
Let's jump off there a little bit more. Can you just elaborate on what your answer to these why questions are, or how you think they should be approached?
Let's take the notion of trade. So this is, I think, a core principle in economics. And there are different reasons why we're going to trade. And so there can be in the moment, why is it that I'm going to trade my money for your good or your services? And why is it that you're willing to supply it to me? There's something that I want done in the moment. And so I'm going to act because I want that to happen. And you're going to act because you want something to happen. And how we act, that's where all of this marginal neoclassical analysis comes into play. But to get to that point, that you are a person who wants to sell a good or service and do it honestly, means you come with it with a character. There's a set of all of which is implied before you even go through the act of selling the good to me. And I'm coming up and offering in my money in good faith, and I'm coming to you, and involves a character. And so there's something there that makes the trade in the moment work. So that's part of the problem. But also we learned all of this from history. Like we learned this from our parents. We learned these notions of how we trade come along. And these notions of trade generate benefits for us. And so the fact that we have these regularized trading mechanisms means we're creating more. So those are all different why questions that we see people trade in them. There's why you and I trade. There's you and I. There's this kind of general abstract character to how we trade. Then there is these long run effects of the benefits of the trade. And then what I would argue is there's also what is it that makes human beings possible to do this when no other animal on the planet does it? And that's what I'd argue would be the kind of material cause. What is it about the genes of human beings that make it possible for us to do that? So those are all ways of trying to get at the question of why is it that people trade? And some of it is neoclassical marginal trade-offs on the margin, but it's much bigger than that.
Hey everybody, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody so much for listening to my show. This has really been a dream come true for me, to be able to speak with scholars that I admire and read books every week that I'm always excited to read. This is still a small show, still a new show, still growing, and I appreciate everyone listening so much. If you want to help me grow my show, the simplest thing you can do is to write a review, just a short review, a sentence or two, on Apple Podcasts, or just recommend it to a friend. So I'm just reaching out to you to beg you humbly on my knees to please do that. I'm going to try not to bug you too much about it, but here I am bugging you. Anyway, back to the show. You make a lot of use of Aristotle's various conceptions of causation, which I've always frankly struggled with. So can you maybe walk us through what these different types of causation are and how they relate to, because I don't think all of them really map easily onto a modern English conception of the word cause, but some of them do more than others. Can you say a little bit about what they are and then what you think they add to the study of economics?
So I would say if you accept that utility maximization, if you even just look at how economics is presented in our textbooks, it's always about how and how much. And we kind of take for granted that people are traders, people respect property, there's division of labor. What Aristotle gives us is a way of 4 different ways of answering why. Why do we trade one thing for another? Why do we respect property? Why do we divide our labor? And he says there's 4 different ways that can happen. And so his kind of example is there's a statue out there. So why is there a statue? And there's a material part of that. There's a material cause of why there's a statue is that there's this metal, there's this bronze that's here. And so there's something in the physical world is the matter by which things happen. And in economics, the matter is this body, genes that came together to create life that differentiates from, say, chimpanzees, bonobos, and our primate cousins. There's something different about us that allows us to do something. In particular, I would argue is that our genes give us a brain that allows us to have a mind that thinks outside the here and now. So that's the material part. And it says, okay, that's the cause. Why is there a statue? Because there's metal there. But then there's a statue, but it's a statue of an image. And so it's Zeus, not Artemis. And so it's a form. It looks like something, and it's abstract. It's not just in like metal has to look and take on a particular abstract feature to it that we call it a statue. Otherwise, it's a mound of metal. And so why is there a statue? There's a form to it. And generally forms are compared to, it's this form, but not that form. So it's a Zeus, it's not an Artemis. And I think this is important then to apply to economics. There's a form to what we call what is trade. And this is important because part of the tensions in economics are, well, is this being made under duress? And so all those kind of concerns immediately come to a student's mind when you talk about economics and trade. And The form is no, I'm talking about the ones that are freely, voluntarily done in the moment, that you're not being forced out of starvation and need to trade for things. That's something else. That's not the kind of canonical form of trade that we're talking about in economics. So those are the kind of two of the four causes. And they go together in the sense that the material kind of has evolved over time into this form. So somehow human beings got this form of this thing that we call trade. I would call it the genotype of trade. I do something good for you, you do something good for me. We want to do the good something for each other. And we say, this is not mine, it's yours, and you do the same thing for me. That's trade.
So far, we've got Aristotle's two types of causes, the material cause and the formal cause. And you were using the example of a statue, and then you're also talking about trades. The material cause is like the physical substance that in theory makes it possible or is necessary to it. So like bronze in the case of the statue, or, human genes that make possible, have made possible human evolution. And then the formal cause, or, the specific form that matter takes, or the specific patterns. So the bronze is shaped to look like Zeus rather than Artemis, or, human mind, I guess in this case, as the genes have actually developed a human brain with a human mind capable of symbolic thought and trade or something like that. Am I with you so far?
Yes. And
Okay.
so those are two different why questions, right? One is from what? Why is there a statue? From what? Why do we trade? Because we got a set of genes and a physical body with a brain that gives us a symbolic mind. And then the formal cause is, what is the form of it? What shape does it take? And that means we're going to abstract, right? So we can go down and trace the genes separating a chimpanzee from a human being. It's about somewhere between 3 to 9% of our DNA, depending on how they count. And we can see that difference. But what's important is there's a form to it, an abstract form to it. And I'm arguing all property has a form to it, all trade has a form, which you can then apply across human history and across cultures and times and people that all kind of fit this. And that explains where trade comes from. And then part of my project is, so embedded in that form is the notion of something that's moral, meaningful, values, and things like that. Those are two of them. Then why is it that there is a statue here? Well, some sculptor took and poured the bronze into a cast and he made it. Like, it didn't just appear on the planet. He did something to it. He shaped it. And that's the efficient cause. The matter has been moved by some means, that's the how part of it, to look like Zeus.
The efficient cause seems like the one that is most closely related to just the modern English conception of what we think of when we hear a cause. What caused this?
And that's really thanks to kind of Bacon and the scientific revolution that kind of that's a cause. This thing has been moved physically and changed into this. And that's particular. So that's like this set of bronze right here turned into this statue right here.
Rather than the existence of bronze made possible the forming of statues in general.
It's a cause. Like, I'm looking right, this statue right here. It came about because somebody poured stuff into this cast and made it. And that's where I think economics lies. Why is it that people are trading? People are doing stuff right here, right now. How does that happen? Well, prices change, so I trade off how I'm going to buy stuff. There's income effect, there's the substitution effect. So that's all very how-oriented, very efficient causes of the world. But I would argue, and like I do in the book, is that even in there, we tend to ignore that there's going to be value judgments being made in those moments. And so economics can add some value. We can add some meaning to those processes as well. The last one is the most controversial of the four, is the final cause, the teleology. Teleology gets people worried because it has this notion from Aristotle. There's this unmoved mover. There's this notion of God out there in some sense that's kind of causing things to move. I'm arguing you don't have to resort to that you can, following biology, have a naturalized version of a final cause. And biology gives us this example, but it's a purpose for what this kind of trait or a thing you see in the world has come about. Again, it's an abstraction in the sense that it's not a particular one. It's like, why in general do we see these statues being made? So in that case, there's a very purpose. the sculptor wants to create a piece of art, he wants to create a gift, or he wants to, honor a god. But there's a purpose for what it comes about. But that purpose there is coming from this mind, and then kind of the reluctance to go with theology as an explanation is because, you're going to resort to some big mind out there that you need to have in order to explain this. Let's call it God. Biology gets around that, saying, no, things can have these meaningful observations in the world by just evolving over time. So now I want to couch these four causes in a biological sense to kind of pull this together. So the specific genes, those are your material cause for, let's call it basal. So you got collections of all your ACGTs all around, they make basal. There's a set of them when they're put together in a particular way that gives you this plant that looks like basil as opposed to any other plant. That's the formal cause. It's called the genotype. And then if you want to like, well, why is it that basil tastes the way it does? Well, you can see the actual chemical process. That's the efficient cause right here, right now. This thing causes the flavor of what it tastes like basil right here. But the final cause is, why does basil taste like basil over all these years? What's been going on? Well, beetles don't like that flavor. So the plants that happen to have it survive and carry it on. And so basil has that taste for the purpose of keeping away beetles. Not because there was any intention behind it, as in the sculptor example, but just so happened that it got selected for and that's what remained. It also works the same way in the positive sense, where human beings like the taste of basil, so therefore we plant the basil plant, and the ones that taste good keep around. So there's this purpose, this final cause in biology that has nothing, that is the reason for why something exists. I would argue trade has those same things. This is what we recognize, that trade exists because it creates more stuff for us. And so to tie that back to notion of scarcity, because there's more of it, that's why this process comes about. And so the scarcity is not the kind of the starting point. It's what we're trying for observing why people trade. It's that people are trading to overcome something that's going on in the world. And it just happens to trade works well for us to do that.
Overcoming scarcity is our goal and motive and why we're engaging in trade.
It's the reason why, yes, the benefits from trade are the reason why we keep doing the trading. But keep in mind, those benefits for having those mechanisms aren't the why you are in right. You want to eat. You want this thing. It's not like, because of the benefits of trade, that's why I'm doing the trade. That's why human beings do this. So the trick is to kind of distinguish between you, the particular, from the abstract feature of this thing that I'm seeing going on over human history. Those are two different things.
Yes. Yeah. Because if you're talking about this abstract custom in human history that's persisted for a long time, you probably want something more like an evolutionary explanation or a functionalist explanation. Like what has this served? What
Yes.
function has this served that's made it survive? On an individual level, I mean, I understand that Aristotle's philosophy is shot through with teleology in general, and that element of it makes him seem outdated. But in something like economics or human behavior is where it seems the most appropriate in some ways, because at least straightforwardly humans do have goals and telos, and we do things for certain purposes on the individual level.
Yes, and but that's in the efficient cause of our actions. I want something to happen. That's why I do something. And so I have that purpose. It just so happens that my purpose, and lots of people have these purposes, and we use trade to bring them about.
Oh, I was thinking of the efficient cause as the how. I did this, so this happened. And the final cause was as the why. I did this because I wanted to enrich myself through trade or something.
There is a how, but I'm also arguing in that how, we also have meaning that I want something to happen.
Okay.
Right? And that's how we understand everyday actions. We use those notions of what I would call mental predicates, what somebody feels, what somebody thinks, what they know, what they want, to say, that's why Chris does what Chris is doing. And that can have meaning. But when I'm talking about the final cause, I'm not just talking about your meeting. I'm talking about lots of people's meetings, and they all seem to be doing this, and they all seem to be doing it the same kind of general way because it's all creating benefits for them. Even though your trading is not for benefiting the world, your trade is for because I want this food right here.
If economists were to adopt the framework that you lay out in this book here, do you think there are surprising conclusions that they would come to, or in like future economic work?
Well, what I would hope is that it kind of opens up the box of questions that we can ask. And so we start asking questions about why, and then we are going to be doing more than just this narrow predicting how and how much is going to happen. And so if we want to ask questions, and I think that's where behavioral economics is going, about why we do good things for other people, perhaps we want to do more than just put it into this model of how trading off one interest for another and say, what's the larger picture? What's the abstract form of this? Or what is the function of this? Why does it exist? As opposed to just kind of building our model and saying, here's how and how much people would do if they feel this way.
What other social sciences do you think, if any, can add to the puzzle for economics to expand in this direction?
Well, I think we need all of the social sciences in that sense. We need to be anthropological.
Because you seem very cross-disciplinary in your book that is billed as an economics book, but there's clearly a lot of cross-disciplinary work going on in your writing.
I take the kind of advice from Vernon Smith to read broadly and work narrowly. So I would say that was my idea behind the last book, The Property Species. I want to understand, why do human beings have the custom of property? Why do we do this? And then I read very broadly to try to put together that story and understanding that. And so I had to draw upon anthropology. It had to draw in some psychology. It has to draw in sociology. It has to draw in ethics in that sense. And so, but what is the question? My question is a very economic one. Why do we have this thing called property? What does that mean? And so that is kind of a different way of thinking about how to do economics, is to find your economic question, but then read very broadly outside of it to kind of build your explanation of what you want to say about a particular problem.
So in introducing moral sentiments and moral ideas into the economic way of thinking, do you think that requires, some particular view of moral philosophy? I mean, in some sense, utilitarianism is a moral view, and it's one that does seem represented in economics, but it's maybe different than Adam Smith's view. But would you comment on that?
First, utilitarian is a moral philosophy, but you wouldn't know that if you read any economics. Like they explicitly say it's not. It's just a tool. It's a method of saying, if somebody prefers B to A, therefore we will say they have preferences for B over A and give them a higher number for B than to A. That's it. They're not going to argue with some ethical theory. But then we start talking about better. I'm like, you can't get to better without some moral theory somewhere being brought in. So I like your question because I'm very clearly, my work is built out of the tradition of Adam Smith, the kind of Scottish Enlightenment ideas of how all this works. But you don't have to start there. I think you could have another set of moral philosophy and tie that into your anthropology and your psychology and your sociology and bring it to bear on a question in economics. But that's just the one that I think kind of works and how I understand it. I think it has a notion of cause in there. Adam Smith is about moral sentiments really being the cause of why we do what we do. And so that works for me, I think. But I mean, there are plenty of other ways, I think, for people to explore the world in a way that wouldn't have to just start with Adam Smith.
Here are some central concepts you raised in the book a lot and you highlight: the human mind, symbolic thought and language, property, trade, specialization, division of labor, and prosperity. So I'm going to try to connect these concepts roughly in that order, and I want you to tell me if you think this is correct, whether it's central to your book or not. But this was almost a causal story I was telling as I was reading it. So the human mind plays a fundamental role, and the human mind not just any mind, but the human mind as we know it has enabled symbolic thought and language, which is, enables us to think about things not just here and now, but in the future and over the hill, etc., and far off in distance and space and time. So symbolic thought and language then enables the idea of property because we can symbolically connect objects to people, and the idea that, one person is able to use some property and that they should be able to and I shouldn't be able to. The idea of property then enables trade because you can't really have trade if there isn't some fairly stable relationship between objects and people before the trade, and then that relationship can change after the trade. So property enables trade. Trade enables specialization and division of labor because it doesn't really make sense to specialize or divide your labor. If you can't trade, you have to kind of do everything yourself. But once you can trade, you can specialize and then trade what you specialize in for what someone else specializes in. And then specialization and division of labor enables innovation, prosperity, more production, etc. Does that sound right?
That is a fantastic just summary and line of thread throughout the book. The only thing I would add is the kind of explicitly that the symbolic thought that allows acts of language are what make trade, and what make property. A speech act is required for us to say, this is mine, this is not yours.
I was picturing that as language, but that's, the idea of language is not the same thing as a specific speech act.
So language makes it possible, but the speech act, there are different kinds of speech acts that make property work. And then there are speech acts that make trade work. And then I think speech acts, I guess the way I talk about it in the book is a little less directly on point there, but speech acts are involved with division of labor, but really property and trade are speech acts at their core. If you took that away, then that's exactly what I had in mind. To see that is the core of understanding. And that's different than how we kind of teach our economics.
What do you think is the most important thing that Adam Smith and the classical economists get wrong that more modern economists get right?
So Hume, I think, is very closely related to Smith, but he often kind of saw the benefits to society being the cause of individual actions on the ground. So I think that is a mistake of his that he sees throughout. What did Smith get wrong that economists get right? I think it's less that he got wrong that he just didn't go somewhere. So he didn't understand marginal analysis, but unlike, and I used to believe this when I read him, that he was confused about it. I don't think he was confused about it. He just did not see that as a problem that he needed to explain. It wasn't there. And I think that marginal analysis is very important that modern economics gets right. I just wouldn't criticize him for getting it wrong. I just say he just doesn't do anything with it. He doesn't, in a way, he's interested in understanding a group, how markets adjust as a group, and modern economics wants to understand it at a much finer level, like how is it the individuals adjusting to things. So that's what I think modern economics needed to do to really, to understand why demand curves slowed downward.
I actually haven't read Smith, but, does he try to develop some kind of price theory? Does he try to explain why prices are what they are? And don't you need marginality to do that?
He understands it as a process. That is, if more suppliers are coming in, you'll see the price go down. If you see more buyers coming in, you'll see the price going up. And so he very clearly sees that. He sees it as a process. What modern economics tries to do is to make it a state. Here's a demand, here's a supply, and here is the P that comes out of it. And I think that's useful for certain problems that we needed to kind of develop it that way. But Smith kind of never would kind of make it static in that sense. He wouldn't be interested in a price. He'd be interested in how is it that prices in general come about.
What kind of reactions have you been getting? I know the book is when did it come out? Very recently.
Oh yeah, just end of December. So I'm still waiting for a review. But I think a general impression is I've given it to students. Some students have read it. I've worked with some students who've read it. It resonates very well with them. And that was kind of my motivation for writing it. I wanted to kind of reach some of the students who might not be like I was in my first econ class saying, this is exactly how I see the world. Now I have this tool. So I think it speaks to students. We'll see. I'm kind of what the profession. I'm going to give some talks out here in the spring. We'll see what the responses will be. But my goal is to add to, not to substitute. I think there's a general sense in economics that if you come up with something that you're doing differently, that it's to replace. This is not about replacing the current textbook, but I would like to kind of expand and open the way we think about and talk about economics as having meaning, value, and purpose.
And I know you saw some high praise from Deirdre McCloskey and David Schmidt, so that's a big win.
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations for books that would complement this one especially well? In addition to, we mentioned your previous works with Vernon Smith, Humanomics, as well as The Property Species. And anything else you would recommend?
Well, David Schmitz's Living Together, I think, is a great book.
Seconded, and I did get to talk to him about that book on the show, and it's a wonderful book.
And then kind of one that really, I mean, if you're a kind of early student, a first-year student, you should read The Rational Optimist. I think Matt Ridley, in a way, is an inspiration for this. I really wanted to explain why human beings are the only animal to trade one thing for another. And so if you're a first-year student, that's a great book to read. And even though it was written in 2010, the core ideas there are extend till now. Let's see. The other kind of person that in the background would be Deirdre McCloskey's The Bourgeois Virtues. That's a little heavier of a read, but it was important for me in the sense of, sure, I understand that good values make for good business, but it took me a while to really understand that good business gives us good values. And that's part of what this is going on in my book as well, is that the idea that it's going both directions, that there are values that go into what I do, and then because these things are successful and the customs are passed on, give me values back. And so property is a value that we want to retain it, and we think is valuable, comes because it has existed and done all this positive work for us. And so her work really kind of got me thinking along that both directions ways of my values affecting the world and the world affecting me and my values.
Did you see, was it Art Carden that did a kind of a summary of the trilogy, a more popular summary of the trilogy, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich? Is it easier, more digestible?
That is an easier read, yes. But
it's not the same. I did go through the whole trilogy and really enjoyed it, but it's a lot.
Well, it's 2,000 pages, yes. And that's without all the notes and stuff like that.
Yes. Anyway, what are you working on next?
So
I know you just finished this, but
this just finished. But I really want to get understanding what we mean by choice. And so I have kind of the organizing title behind how I want to put the next project together is Choosing Like a Human. So what does it mean to choose? I would argue that modern economics is very tautological about it. I chose it, therefore I preferred it. I prefer it because I chose it. Doesn't get at the heart of explaining how choice works. I think the attention is this. We want, in the moment, there's something going inside my mind that causes me to choose. And then there are the effects that are the reason for why the choice, kind of implications of those choices. So there's objective things about the world and there's subjective parts of the choice. And we're stuck kind of saying, well, there's the subjective and there's the objective. We want both of these things and we can't square them. I want to try to bridge that with what kind of, I would argue, an Adam Smith kind of intersubjectivity, which is hinted at in this book and kind of implied in here, but I really want to bring that out. What does it mean to be intersubjective in economics?
Where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work, Bart?
I'm on Twitter at Bart Wilson. Also on Blue Sky at Bart Wilson. And yeah, those are the two main places.
Awesome. My guest today has been economist Bart Wilson, returning guest, and his book has been Meaningful Economics, Making the Science of Prosperity More Human. Bart, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.